Okay, well that's it for the module-based examples. Now we're going to have a quick look at some form-based examples. So this is where we're using the DataList object as a data source for list, box, and combo objects. So let's just have a look at the basic data binding. We'll open this form up and have a look at it. So this is pretty simple. It's just got a list. Let's go and have a look at the code behind. So you can see here, you're familiar with it by now, we've got a private variable that's local to this form, which is a new data list. We've added the customers. We're setting up the column headings, so recall that you can set up the column headings to be different to the column names. That's what we've done, and then we've called a function to bind this list box to the DataList object. That's pretty simple. We just call xf.bindDataList and bind DataListX if it's an extended object. Bind list box, then we pass in the name of the control, customer, and the data list. It's that simple, and then we do a requery operation. So what happens when we run this? Pretty simple, really. So this is just an example of binding with code. Let's go back into design view. It's a pretty simple example of binding with code. So, we've got all these options that we've just looked at. We can filter, we can sort, we can do all those fancy things if we like before we get to this point of binding it. Once it's bound, we can go back and filter or sort and then requery the object if we like. So it's greatly flexible. So there's quite a few advantages to using the data list as a data source. For a start, if you're using the value list function, there's a limit to the length of the text you can pass in as a row source object. Plus it has to slice and dice that, and it's quite slow. If you're binding it to a table or query in the database, you've got the issue that it keeps hitting the database every time you open the form up. Whereas with the data list, you've got the option of caching that in memory. And you'll also find that if you've got a lot of data in your list, then it will only partially load it usually, and as you scroll through the list, it can be quite slow. Whereas again, with the data list, you just pull that data in once at the start, and it's almost instantaneous from there on because it's all memory based. Now you can see we've got a slightly weird way of referencing the data list. Let's just have a quick look at that. This is a little known thing in Access. It's documented in the help, but it's not very much used. So the row source type is one of these three things, but we can also choose a function as a row source type just by pasting that in rather than choosing from the list. And now that we've done this, when the list box wants some data, it will actually call this function for the data, and it's got a prescribed format. So here we are. I've just hit F1 on the row source type. So this is just the note here. You can set it with a user-defined function, and you just enter the function name, and then you need specific code arguments. So this is what our function must look like. We've got a particular template we must comply to in order for that to work. But that's exactly what we've done here. We've written a row source function that will look in the data list for its data and simply return it to the object. If you really want to find this, we can actually go looking for it. So the function lives in the lbbind module, and you can have a look in here if you like, but it's not very pretty. It's just kind of plumbing code really. All it does is adapt the data in the data list for use in the combo or list box. Okay, so that's the very basic form of data binding. There's a few interesting extra ways of doing things here. So let's open this one up. And we'll go into the code again. Now you find this one's actually completely codeless. So what I've done here is print onOpen in the open event and onLoad in the form load event to the debug window. And that's just so you can see the order of events. But obviously neither of these are necessary. This is actually completely codeless if we want it to be. So what we've done is, again, we've got our familiar row source function here. If you want to use the data list, you just paste that function name in. But this time we've actually put a row source in here. So what this is going to do is it's got some code which will automatically look this up in the current database and cache it in memory. and pass it to the row source function. Now let's go to, so you can see here, this is what it's done. It's just cached that data as a delimited list on open, on load. Now what it's actually done is cache it for the life of the database. So we can close this form and we can go and open it again and go back here, and you can see this one, it said DB read. So the very first time you open it, it's going to read it from the database. The second time we open it, it's using the cached copy. So it's actually saved this. And what it does is store it in a list, and it uses this SQL as the key to the list. How do we clear that cache, I hear you ask, because that is actually a fairly important thing to be able to do. Well, if we go xf bind DataList SQL cache, clear cache. So this is an SQL cache object that's actually stored as part of the binding data list module. If we want, we can just retrieve data straight from there. We need to close this form. The next time we reopen it, you'll notice we've done a DB read again. So that's a way of refreshing the cache. Okay, and one last thing to notice about this is we can put this magic value in. So it's possible that you want some code. You want this to be bound to a data list, but rather than having the SQL in the code, you want to store it in a handy place like this, but you don't actually want it to be cached automatically. So if that's the case, you can add the magic value xf code init to the tags. If you've looked into it, you'll know we can have multiple tags separated by semicolons. And if we put this particular tag in, then that just stops it from, let's save that. In this case, it's just ignored the binding. And if we want, we can write some code behind to go through and do the binding as we wish. Now you may also ask why we don't offer the ability to do this without caching. In other words, to just load this up without caching, but that's pretty much the same as doing a table query here. So that's why we don't really offer that option. Okay, and this is kind of the magnum opus of the whole thing. This is what I call a search screen. So let's just have a look at what happens when we run this. Give it a bit more room here. So this is the all singing, all dancing filtered form. So this form allows you to filter and sort on multiple columns. Let's filter for supermarkets on this column. Let's filter out a particular shipping company on this one. And then we can click on these to sort. So this is the one indicates that this is the first sorting column. We can sort on any number of columns we like. So if you click again, you get descending and it indicates it by red, and if you hit a third time, it removes the sort from that column altogether. So let's sort by company, ascending for starters, and then freight costs, ascending. And then we can try freight cost descending within the supermarkets. And these are extra filters here that are implemented in code. You can also see down here, when you click on something and highlight it, it's able to go and pull the data out for that particular item and display it. It doesn't really make much difference here because it's just a company name, but sometimes you've got some comments or something that's quite long in one of these fields, and this allows you to click on it. Even if the field's hidden, you can still display it down here, and that allows the user to see, just have a quick preview of what's going on there. It's a pretty cool form. You can do a lot of things with this, and this is all boilerplate, pretty much. Now, I mean, we could have abstracted all the logic from this form off into another module, but that generally makes things quite complex. So what we've elected to do is just leave all of the code for this form actually in the code behind. It's pretty much automatic though, so like there's all these sort columns here. I think we've got 13 or 14 sort columns in total, and when it starts up, it just looks in here to see what the column widths are, and it automatically formats the widths of these buttons and these search boxes to match the column widths. So it's pretty much all automatic. Let's have a quick look at the code behind. So this is all boilerplate. This stuff is all generic declarations. This is just stuff that you leave alone. That's what it requires to work. And then in this custom declarations section, it kind of hijacks the form load event, so it gives us an option to put some load code in here if we want, which it'll call. It allows us to control things like what happens when we go back, requerying the list. This the double click event determines what happens after you've selected a line, so that's just handling double click. In this case, we're not really doing much after update. Quite often you'll use it to choose a record, so you might want to go to another screen or something. And this is where the initial setup happens. So this is the SQL that we're passing in to actually configure the form. In this case, we're joining a few tables up. It's a little bit complicated. We probably really should have put all this in a query. But you can see here is where it's programmatically inserting these date filters from the main screen in. And it's just doing the stuff that we talked about before. It's adding the result set. It's setting up the display columns. In this case, it's just setting up the default, so it just, as we said a minute ago, mirrors the column sizes of the list box and the column orders and so forth. You can see in the after update event here, this is where we're displaying that details box down the bottom by selecting a particular column. That's pretty much all there is to say. The rest of it's all just boilerplate. So this is the stuff that handles all of the click events and filter events and all the different filters. I just wanted to show you here where it binds the list box. So this is form load, where it sets everything up, hides everything, and then formats the size of everything. Then eventually it binds the list box to the list which is a standard form object up here. And it binds it to the list on the screen. So that's it for the data list control. This is the really the final result of all the work on it. And all this filtering and sorting is just happening in the list. There's no database access required for that. So that's about it for the data list tutorial.